Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is all part of our Risks and Regulations event, which is running online today. I'm Chloe McCulloch. I'm the Editorial Director of Building Design and Housing Today. And this webinar is all about the introduction of Gateway 1 as part of new rules coming into force on the 1st of August, I think I'm right in saying. But we have expert speakers here to tell you much more about it. So we've got Amanda Stubbs, the partner at Trowers & Hamlin, a legal firm. We have Andrew Miller, partner at the Architects PRP. And we have Chris Allery, Technical Director of the fire engineering firm Hydrock. Before I hand over to them, I just want to do just a little bit of housekeeping, just a reminder that this is just an hour long, but throughout that hour, please post your questions, and those questions we will store up for the end for a Q&A session. So the more questions, the better, and we've got lots of people attending this session, so we may not get through all of them individually, but what I can do is ask questions by sort of theme. So hopefully, if your question will be kind of answered across a sort of thematic way, I guess. So another point, people always ask, can they get this again if they have to pop out or miss a section or want to pass it on to a colleague? Yes, you can. This is being recorded and it will be available on demand, so you'll be able to see the presentations again. So do log back in if you can't attend the whole of this session. And finally, this is the first of two webinars today. So we have another one at 2 p.m. and that is CPD accredited. So if you do want to come back for that, just go back onto our websites and you can register for free to attend those. So that is quite enough for me. I'm going to hand over to Amanda first, and the rest of us will turn off our webcams and we will hand presenter status over to Amanda so she can share her slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe. So is that okay for everybody?
That looks great, Amanda, thank you.
Fine. Yeah, so I'm going to do a quick introduction from a very sort of a legal point of view in terms of what the new law says and what that means, but then Andrew and Chris are going to apply it specifically to sort of the more practical aspects of the sort of pre-application stage. So just by way of a bit of background, the Building Safety Bill has come out of the Hackitt review into the building regulations and fire safety that took place in 2018. And following that review and Dame Judith Hackitt's report, I thought we were going to see a complete rewrite, as in a sort of a blank sheet of paper and brand new legislation. When we got to the MHCLG consultation on the proposed legislation in July 2019, it was clear that what was going to happen would be an enhancement and sort of rework of what we already have. So that was a bit of a surprise, but as a result, what we see going through all the legislation, the changes that are going to come, is enhancements at every phase. And this morning's focus is on Gateway 1, which is the pre-application stages of planning. And in effect, it's an enhancement of what already happens. So there's that background to it in order to explain we're not looking at something radically new at this point. So I'm going to look briefly at the background, talk about the legal detail, and then finish with a couple of points sort of to take away. So as I explained, there was the consultation and that resulted in the draft Building Safety Bill, and that has two key aims. It aims to enhance fire safety of in-scope buildings, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And also it introduces this concept of gateways, which is effectively a series of pauses to ensure that as a development goes forward, there are opportunities to make sure it's right in terms of fire safety and building safety at each point. So it's a sort of an artificial slowing up and consideration at strategic points in the process intended to safeguard the safety of that development ultimately. So the legal elements of this are the Town and Country Planning Development Management Procedure and Section 62A Applications England Amendment Order 2021, which is a bit of a mouthful and not terribly meaningful. So there is already a Development Management Procedure Order of 2015, and that is being amended to deal with the changes that are needed for Gateway 1. And essentially what this new legislation will do when it comes in August this year is impose new procedural requirements prior to planning permission. Before planning permission can be granted, there are two key elements. The developer must submit a fire statement setting out the fire safety considerations specific to the development, where the application involves one or more relevant buildings. And we'll talk about some of these definitions in a minute. And the second element is that the HSE, or what will be the building safety regulator, is to be a statutory consultee for relevant planning applications. So those are the two things that the new legislation will do. The regulations are very short. They're amendment regulations, just a few pages long, and not a lot to get your head around really on the title of the regulation. So in terms of what this means, the changes will apply to relevant buildings, and those are ones that contain two or more dwellings or are education accommodation, so where you've got residential space within boarding schools, university halls of residence, etc. So basically contain dwellings and meet the height condition of 18 metres plus or 7+ stories, whichever is reached first. Now, that definition of what is an in-scope building or a higher risk residential building for the purposes of the building safety legislation is not currently set in stone, as in that is what the MHCLG guidance proposes to be the definition of an in-scope building or a relevant building for the purposes of these regulations. But because it's not actually fixed, that could in theory change because it's going to be the subject of secondary legislation. And I think the original sort of thinking behind keeping that flexible was that it may well be expanded, as in the definition will contain a wider number of buildings, because the Hackitt review worked on the basis of buildings that were 30 metres plus. So in other words, only the really high rise blocks, whereas the MHCLG draft legislation is 18 metres plus, and there was talk of 11 metres plus. So that definition is going to be in secondary legislation and is deliberately left open so that the Secretary of State can change it if he or she so desires. But that's the definition we're working with, which is the Building Safety Bill definition as well for these purposes. So relevant planning applications, in other words, the ones to which this new Gateway 1 arrangements will apply, are where you've got one or more, the planning applications for one or more relevant buildings, or development of an existing relevant building, and or development within the curtilage of a relevant building. So only those planning applications are affected by these by this new regime. And there are specifically some exempt applications, which are those where you're applying for a material change of use of a relevant building, and as a result of which it won't be a relevant building anymore. It won't be residential, for example. Or you've got a material change in use of land and buildings within the curtilage of a relevant building. So again, that takes that outside the definition of a relevant planning application. Also where you go for outline planning permission, because the scope and the layout of the development can be reserved, and therefore it's not necessarily going to bite as soon as you submit an outline application. So the outline applications are outside this regime as well. And then the final point, I've just included it for completeness, but it's a technical point about where you are varying a planning permission using Section 73. So those are the relevant buildings, the relevant applications, and the exemptions. So that is how the legislation will bite. And essentially, the new legislation is due to come into force from August 2021, but because the draft building safety bill is still being revised, and our understanding is that it is actually undergoing quite a few changes since the draft version was produced, it's going to be subject to parliamentary scrutiny, and it's not expected therefore to come into sort of proper effect until 2023 because of the need for quite a lot of secondary legislation. So as a result of that, I don't know, I mean, I assume that Gateway 1 will still go forward in August as planned, but there is, I think, a concern that you need the wider framework of the building safety bill, so it may not happen in August. But essentially, what that will mean is that relevant applications may need to be accompanied by a fire statement as early as August 2021. So that's what we need to sort of gear up for and plan towards. The HSE, in the form of the building safety regulator, it's intended to be a sort of more proactive role. They will be providing specialist fire safety input to a relevant application to assist the local planning authority in its decision-making process. But my sort of final point really is that I don't see this as vastly different from what happens currently, in the sense that we, if you're doing a design and access statement, for example, for a building, then, you know, fire safety will be one of the considerations. So I think it's I regard Gateway 1 as a sort of formalisation and sort of prioritisation of current practices rather than anything fundamentally different, whereas there are aspects of the building safety regime to come, no spoilers intended, that are much more radical than Gateway 1. But I'll now hand over to Andrew to talk a bit in more detail as to how this works in practice.
Hi there, sorry, I think my my internet just went out there at the very end. But just before we go over to Andrew, if you're still picking me up and I'm not breaking up all over the place, I just had a really quick follow-up question there, Amanda. You mentioned that there's some concern that you might need the wider regulatory framework before this 1st of August deadline. Do you know what discussions are going on at sort of government level or industry level around that, and how much uncertainty there actually is?
It's all gone quite quiet. I mean, the order, the town country planning order, is drafted on the basis that it is the HSE that will take this, the statutory consultee role. And obviously, in the fullness of time, it's going to be the building safety regulator. And it may be that there is, in practice, it would need to be the fire authorities, because my understanding is that the HSE doesn't yet have the relevant experience internally for doing this sort of advice in a housing context. Obviously the fire authorities have that expertise, and they are going to be part of the building safety regulator, but we're not there yet because we haven't got the building safety bill. So that's really why my concern is that it may not happen in August as planned, because a lot of the practicalities around it are not in place. But that said, it's drafted in a way that it can go forward with the HSE as the statutory consultee. So, to answer your question shortly, no, I don't know. I just think there's doubt there.
Yeah, I mean, so your advice to people listening on this call is assume it's happening, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Assume it's happening. It will be the HSE that is the statutory consultee, and you need to do your fire statement if you've got a relevant planning application going in.
Okay. Just one. Sorry, I cut you off there, Amanda. Did I?
Sorry. So, if for relevant planning applications that are going to be submitted after the 1st of August, this will apply.
Fine. And just one other thing before I forget, I know you mentioned exemptions to this, and I may have this wrong, or maybe things have changed, but I thought permitted development was considered one exemption at one stage. Has that changed?
No, I think that is still outside. It's not expressly mentioned in the regulations because I think it would be outside the order in the first place. So I think that is right. It's not, because permitted development wouldn't apply to the sorts of higher risk buildings that we're looking at.
Fine. Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. We will move on to Andrew. Just a quick reminder to the audience, please post your questions, and I will put them to the expert panel at the end. So do use the opportunity just to post your questions from now on, and I will be looking through those and picking them for the Q&A session at the end. Okay, Amanda and I will turn off our mics and cameras, and it's over to Andrew, and hopefully he'll be able to share his screen.
Can you see that, Chloe?
That is looking great, and that is in presenter mode. And Amanda, I'm not sure if you can, oh, that's it, brilliant. Okay, off you go.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think the first thing to say is that Gateway 1 has now been renamed as Planning Gateway 1, which might suggest in time that Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 get a new name as well, but certainly this is now known as Planning Gateway 1. In my opinion, this is going to be the easiest of the gateways. I think there's much more to do in terms of preparation and documentation for Gateway 2 and Gateway 3. And they're also known as hard stops, as later gateways. I think from our perspective as PRP, I think a lot of the information that's required for submission at Gateway 1, at Planning Gateway 1, is already produced, and certainly has been produced since Grenfell, when everyone seems to have upped their game and produced more information on fire safety. But now it's been submitted earlier in the process. So instead of a building regulations application stage, it's now been submitted at planning. Of course, you will still submit it at building regulations, but you're preparing that information and submitting it in whatever form, and we're going to come on to tell you that in a second. So as was just said, the fire statement is alongside a detailed plan application. It will be a standard form throughout the country, so no local authority will have a different form. It will be a standard form, and it can be submitted online, which will be a dynamic form with text input, or a static paper form, which you fill out by hand or as PDF format, and you submit that with your planning application. Importantly here, it applies to the whole development and not just the building, not just the relevant building. So you can imagine you have a development which has a relevant building, a building which is above 18 meters or 7 stories and above, and then you have a number of lower rise residential or mixed use blocks or student accommodation blocks. And they will all be included in the fire statement along this side, this submission, and that may deter developers actually producing taller blocks or proposing to develop taller blocks and just having more medium rise blocks which sit under this trigger height. I work as a technical advisor for MHCLG on the Building Safety Act, and my team and I did some comparison work with some fire engineers in the industry supporting MHCLG as well. And the estimated time to complete this fire statement form is 1 to 2 hours. It is not onerous if you have the information and data alongside you to complete in itself, much of which, as I've just stated, you are already completing on the projects in any case. Which is why I referenced, I think this is possibly the easiest of the proposed gateways to prepare for, and will take the least time and the least cost for developers in preparing that. So Amanda just read out to you what a relevant building is, and I've just put the definition on the screen here. I think the important thing, as Amanda says, is to realise that Dame Hackitt proposed buildings above 30 metres and pure residential buildings at that time as well. It was deemed by Dame Hackitt that the industry couldn't respond to anything other than those buildings because it would just be too many other buildings to deal with. Well, MHCLG pretty quickly said it would be buildings above 18 metres, but they soon realised that 7-storey buildings are often, or there are some 7-storey buildings which are lower than 18 metres. So in the accompanying notes that came out with the draft safety bill last July from MHCLG, there is a statement to say it's 18 metres more in height or above 6 stories. So with this new Planning Gateway 1, we've seen the definition of a relevant building change again, because it's now not just above 6 stories. It's been defined for the better, I believe, in saying 7 or more stories. It could be, as Amanda said, be redefined again. Certainly at consultation stage, it was related to buildings with dwellings in them, and possibly only dwellings. There was very little mention of mixed-use buildings, but with the clarification about 2 or more dwellings, certainly mixed buildings are definitely in scope now where there are 2 or more dwellings. And it could be an office building that's primarily office, but it has 2 flats in there which are used for staff or visitor accommodation, and that would be an in-scope building. And educational accommodation, I believe, certainly it was being considered, but wasn't in scope at the consultation stage, or certainly the response to the consultation. I believe personally that the fire in the student accommodation that happened in Bolton a while ago has influenced the inclusion of educational accommodation in as a relevant building, which may suggest that if there was an incident in another building with sleeping accommodation, perhaps a hospital or care home, then those types of buildings might well be brought into scope before the Building Safety Act is launched and becomes legislation. So what is my practice's approach to Gateway 1? Well, we decided we're going to prepare this fire statement on all projects which we design with sleeping accommodation, no matter the height or that type of the building. We do a lot of what we call later living, so care homes and retirement accommodation. So we believe where the building is a relevant building for the purpose of Gateway 1, that we'll be supporting the fire engineer to complete that form because there's a legal requirement to submit that with a planning application. Where the building is above 11 metres, we'll be completing that form, and if we have an appointed fire engineer on the project, we'll be working with them to complete it. We are at the moment advising all our clients to ensure that those buildings above 11 metres comply with regulation 7.2, so that's no combustible materials in the facades or in attachments, because we believe, and trying to preempt a regulation change, that very soon ADB will include that trigger height in the same way that it is in Scotland. So to clarify, it'll be brought down potentially from 18 metres to 11 metres. And we're just waiting for ADB revisions to come out on that. They should have been earlier in the year, but of course COVID has delayed everything. Where a building is below 11 metres, we're going to continue as PRP to complete that fire statement. We may submit it with the plan applications, but what we're doing that for is to create a digital record for all buildings that we design at the plan application stage with that fire statement information. We've produced guidance for our teams on the process to follow and how to complete the form, and that's separate to the guidance that MHCLG have produced. And we're going to continue to produce this fire strategy statement alongside the GLA fire strategy statement requirement for major projects in London. And I know that Chris is going to say a little bit more about that in a while. So in terms of design process, what is it we're having to do? Well, a team that's required to complete the form, in our opinion, is an architect, an M&E engineer, and a fire engineer. The architect and fire engineer are relatively obvious, but why the M&E engineer? Well, if you recall from the Grenfell inquiry, there's a lot of discussion about water supply to sites, and part of the form is making a statement about ensuring that there is water supply or adequate water supply in an emergency situation to the site, and therefore we're going to need an M&E engineer to input into that part of the form completion. We've got to prepare a site plan with block number and heights, and it's not just the relevant buildings which are above 18 metres or 7 stories, it's all the blocks on the site that are being submitted as part of that planning application. We're going to be producing drawings showing fire service access to the site and to the perimeter of the building, and the hard standing that's being provided for the appliance parking, and I suspect that's multiple appliance parking. Of course, that's a drawing that we typically create at building regulation stage that is being brought forward now to the plan application stage, and then will be amended and resubmitted with the building regulations application or Gateway 2 application as it will be further down the line. The buildings will be definitely or more definitively designed in relation to fire safety compliance, I believe. Not only will be stating what the facade materials are, and of course we'll be doing that for the plan application in any case, we'll be stating that they're compliant with regulation 7.2, so in terms of non-combustible materials. I guess we would be doing that in any case because we'd have selected the materials. But here I'm thinking more about the form of the building, ensuring that the dry riser is in the right location, the firefighting lifts, the firefighting shaft, etc., are all designed in the building at an early stage. We often get asked to pick up detailed drawing packages for buildings designed by others, and we often find they're not compliant with regulations for a number of reasons. But I think more and more so designers will be focusing on making sure their buildings are absolutely compliant with certainly fire safety legislation at the plan application stage. One requirement will be the evacuation strategy, and considering that this is a very early stage, and the provision of accessible housing, and that's really to understand who the future occupants might be, and whether the evacuation strategy is going to have to respond to those with mobility problems or disabilities. I think that's it from me. I think it's there just to say that I think this is now commonplace. All this information has been prepared and required for planning Gateway 1, specifically post Grenfell. It is. And therefore, I think the work involved in preparing this submission is little. And I think it's the few hours related to completing the form that's the important time and budget allocation that's required. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I've just got a couple of questions to follow up on, if that's okay. I guess it's good news that it's not going to be overly onerous, this Gateway 1 and filling in the new form. But in terms of, I guess it would be interesting to know, in terms of as an architecture practice, when you're considering the overall sort of regime change and regulations coming down the track, what has PRP had to put in place in terms of additional resource, in terms of getting the expertise in-house, and how have you sort of managed that, I suppose?
I mean, if we specifically think about fire safety, we have 2 people employed in the business who are new to the business within the last 2 years, who are specifically focused on fire safety. One of them particularly is looking at products, and we have a huge problem working with manufacturers at the moment, trying to assess the performance of their products in relation to fire safety and assess the certification and compliance with the building regulations. And the other one really is there to look at things like this planning gateway and how it's implemented and the guidance to the architects, but also to undertake, well, they both undertake fire safety and technical reviews of our projects. All projects go through a 2-stage process, one at the early pre-planning and one before building regulations, to look at compliance in a lot of detail. So we've developed standard formats for recording that. We've also developed standard formats for forms to create for the digital record in terms of material, specification and compliance. And at the moment, we're developing our own app, which will allow us to actually assess compliance of our project and record those in a digital format. So we've undertaken quite a lot of steps post-Grenfell to make sure that we reduce our commercial risk and make sure that our buildings are safe.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. Well, we will come back to a lot of what you've picked up in your presentation at the end, and we're getting loads of questions in. So thanks very much, everyone. We will try and cover all of that ground towards the end. People have asked if they can get this on a recording, and you can, so don't panic. It will be available on demand. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Chris, and he should be able to share his screen in just a moment. That looks great, Chris. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Chloe. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Firstly, as Chloe mentioned, I'm Chris Allery, Technical Director with Hydrock. I have responsibility for the fire engineering division, focusing on the South East region, based in the London office. So before I start, I just wanted to provide a really quick overview of some of the points I'm going to be discussing within the short presentation. Starting with a brief recap of some of the points that Amanda and Andrew have discussed. So a brief recap of the objectives of Gateway 1, planning Gateway 1, and from a fire engineering perspective. A recap of the types of buildings within the scope of Gateway 1. A quick look at the fire statement document itself from a fire engineering perspective. A discussion regarding the competency requirements for completing the fire statement, and a brief discussion regarding the impact of Gateway 1 with regard to the earlier in fire engineering involvement in new projects within the scope of the Gateway. And finally, a short comparison of Gateway 1 and the GLA London Plan requirements and how they may overlap. So firstly, as I mentioned, I just wanted to provide a short recap of the objectives of Gateway 1 as part of the Building Safety Bill. The government's been committed to transforming the regulatory framework for fire safety since Grenfell Tower fire, from the Dame Judith Hackitt review. The proposed Building Safety Bill is anticipated, as we know, to bring about the biggest change in building safety for a generation, as the tagline. Gateway 1 will ensure fire safety matters as they relate to land use planning are incorporated at the planning stage to schemes involving the relevant high-rise residential buildings. The objective of that is, before planning permission is granted, planning applicants, they now have to submit a fire statement along with the planning application to local planning authorities, and show that the fire service and local fire and rescue service have been consulted at that early stage and can give them due consideration to fire safety. So as I mentioned, secondly, just a brief recap of the types of buildings within the scope of the Gateway. So as mentioned previously, the proposed Gateway 1 requirements will be applicable to residential buildings containing 2 or more dwellings and a story more than 18 metres above ground level, or 7 or more stories. And that does include educational premises such as boarding houses and student accommodation. As Amanda mentioned previously, this does become more complicated again once you start considering the planning applications that are within the scope of the gateway. With regards to the fire statement document itself, the fire safety matters contained in a fire statement are relevant only to the extent they're relevant to the land use planning. So it's not looking at the full breadth and depth of fire safety with regards to building regulations, looking at B1 to B5. It's only those relating to land use planning matters. The fire statement itself is a fixed format for fire engineers to provide a brief and specific response to relevant aspects of the proposed development. The prescriptive format is intended and is designed to achieve a level of consistency to the responses from different fire engineers. It does also include guidance on maximum word counts to ensure responses are brief and specific. We do need to make sure that engineers are permitted to provide adequately detailed proposals, especially for those more complex sites which may contain multiple blocks or potentially multiple different strategies across the site where you've got different fire mains compared to hose distances, sprinklers in some buildings and not others, to make sure that they're covered across the within the fire statement document. The key points to consider to complete within the fire statement include what prescriptive guidance is being adopted, so whether you're looking to utilise approved document B or BS 991, BS 999, where that varies from block to block across the development. If the blocks include combustible materials within the balconies or external walls, I would mention, as we know, that where a building is within scope of Gateway 1, it would also be in scope of the Building Amendment Regulations, or Regulation 7.2, which bans the use of combustible materials in external walls and wall attachments. Therefore, theoretically, there should be no combustible materials within the external walls or attachments of those buildings in the scope of Planning Gateway 1, and have potentially more relevant where the Planning Gateway 1 brings into scope all blocks on that development, where only one block would be exceeding those height threshold criteria. So it also needs to consider if fire suppression is required and whether it's to be included, what provisions are included to accommodate accessible housing, demonstrating that adequate fire tender access roadways are allowed for, so whether you've got access to fire main inlets, or hose distances to different areas of the building, or perimeter access, whatever may be relevant for each block. And additionally, as mentioned previously, that adequate hydrants are available and adequate water supplies in close proximity with sufficient pressure and flow. Hence, there are need to bring in M&E engineers into the discussion. Where it is proposed to deviate from prescriptive guidance with regard to items relating to land use planning, we know that not every building is in complete compliance with the prescriptive guidance. It's really important that these are properly considered at the early stage pre-planning and agreed with all of the approving authorities, which will now include, with the anticipated Planning Gateway 1, the HSE, or perhaps the local fire service. However, it's currently expected that pre-consultation will likely be with the local fire service rather than the HSE directly, but they will be the main consultee for the planning application. So where we're looking to omit sprinkler protection from car parks or commercial units, or where we're looking to provide fire main inlets remote from block entrances due to site constraints, which are a fairly common deviations from prescriptive guidance, where a fire engineer has been engaged and it can be demonstrated that a satisfactory level of safety is achieved for the purpose of the fire safety strategy. This will now need to be considered pre-planning for that pre-consultation with the fire and rescue service, so that it's you have that consultation reference within your application and within the fire statement itself. So briefly on the competency requirements, the associated guidance with the fire statement recommends that fire statements are completed by a suitably qualified engineer with relevant experience in fire safety, such as a chartered engineer registered with the Engineering Council by the Institution of Fire Engineers, or suitably qualified and competent professional with the demonstrable experience to address the complexity of the design being proposed in terms of fire safety. Currently, there are only approximately 300 chartered fire engineers in the UK that are affiliated with the IFE, and with current insurance market tightening, there's probably even less of those with the capability as it stands to work on high-rise residential buildings. So even the impact assessment of the building safety bill document itself acknowledges that it is expected that future work will likely require an increase of at least 50% in fire engineering capacity. So obviously, from a fire engineering perspective, the new planning Gateway 1 will obviously result in earlier required fire engineering input for high-rise and high-risk residential developments. Firstly, fire engineering input will be required at pre-planning stage for all high-rise residential developments in scope of the Building Safety Bill and Gateway 1 in order to complete the fire statement, which is required to be completed by a competent and suitably qualified fire engineer. But additionally, as we know, many more complex developments may not comply with prescriptive guidance and with regard to items relating to land use planning, and therefore this will require consultation with the HSE or potentially the local fire service prior to that planning submission. Similarly to the earlier consultations we have with the building regulations approving authorities, such as building control, approved inspectors, and subsequently with the local and fire rescue service post-planning, we'll need to have those same consultation process with the HSE or local fire service pre-planning in order to complete that fire statement for the planning submission. So finally, I wanted to briefly discuss the potential overlap between the Building Safety Bill Gateway 1 and the London Plan. So policy D12B of the London Plan, which was last released in March 2021, states that all major developments proposed should be submitted with a similarly named fire statement, which is an independent fire strategy produced by a third party or suitably qualified fire assessor. Policy specifies that this fire statement, for the purposes of the London Plan, should detail how the development proposal will function in terms of the building's construction, in terms of methods, products and materials used, and the manufacturer's details for those, means of escape provisions, including details regarding escape cause, escape within corridors, what provisions are made for disabled occupants and associated evacuation strategies, and what features will be provided to reduce the risk of life, so fire alarm systems, smoke ventilation systems and other active and passive fire protection systems, and how those will be managed, and maintenance plans for those systems is the key point. Access for fire service personnel and equipment, how this will be achieved in terms of evacuation, what water supplies are provided, provision and positioning of equipment, firefighting shafts, lifts and lobbies, what fire suppression is provided, if smoke ventilation is provided, and what mechanisms for smoke ventilation are provided, where you have those active fire suppression systems, what ongoing maintenance strategies will be provided for those systems. Additionally, how provisions will be made within the curtilage of the site to enable fire appliance access, and additionally and finally ensuring that any potential future modifications to the building or development will take into account and not compromise that existing fire safety strategy that's been put together. So we can see that the fire statements for the London Plan and the Building Safety Bill Gateway 1, Planning Gateway 1, are very similar in vein, but are keenly different in terms of what content they include, the format of those documents, and who the consultees are for that document. Both the London Plan and Gateway 1 are relatively new proposals, and such we're not currently aware how these requirements are going to interact. Based on the current information, we're expecting that both documents will be required where developments are in scope of both the London Plan and Gateway 1. So that concludes the points I was going to discuss. Chloe, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. There's a load of detail in there, and I'm sure, just to remind listeners, you can see the slides again. So if you've missed any of the detail, that will be available on demand. I was just going to follow up on a couple of things before we go to this sort of general Q&A, and we have had lots of questions in. But there was one bit, I think, where you were saying about the key considerations, and I suppose what would you consider are the key fire safety items relating to design that you need to consider at an early stage when you're thinking about Gateway 1?
My advice would be the key considerations relating to where the proposed development is looking to deviate from prescriptive guidance, where we have simple developments which have compliant fire tender access, adequate sprinkler protection provision, and everything's in place exactly as it should be in accordance with the approved document, or BS 991, that can be quite simply put together in the fire statement with little consultation. But where we are looking to do in most developments deviate from that prescriptive guidance in some format, it requires some fire engineering input to demonstrate that an adequate level of safety is achieved. So, for example, if for a small residential development which would require sprinkler protection, and based on the new changes to approved document B and bringing the threshold for sprinkler protection to go down to 11 metres, it may not be proposed to introduce sprinklers within the commercial units or the car park serving that site, which would be a deviation from the prescriptive guidance, and therefore needs to be, the fire service needs to be consulted before that information can be included within the fire statement. So they're the key points where we're looking to deviate from the prescriptive guidance in some formats. That before we can complete the fire statement, that needs to be shown that we've consulted the fire rescue service and they're suitably happy with the proposals.
Okay, and we've had a couple of questions about the London plan and people who are already putting together statements for boroughs within London. What would you say are the key differences between the Gateway 1 fire statement and the London plan fire statement?
Which interestingly, they're carry exactly the same name, the fire statement. The key differences in terms of the consultees, so the Building Safety Gateway will be consulted through the planning authority to the Health and Safety Executive, whereas the London plan is purely within the London boroughs, within those planning authorities. So that one of the main differences is who the consultee is for those planning documents. Additionally, is the content of those different documents. So in terms of the Building Safety Act and Planning Gateway 1, as Andrew mentioned, it's relatively keeping it trying fairly light and simple in terms of the content. So it's looking at those items relating to land use planning only. So looking at fire tender access roadways, sprinkler protection provisions, external elevations and materials used. And it's within that prescriptive format. Whereas the London plan fire statement is far more detailed in its requirements, considering essentially the full fire strategy from B1 to B5, looking at means of escape provisions, disabled means of escape provisions, looking at inclusive design. It's a significantly more detailed document compared to Gateway 1. Okay,
well, hopefully that's a jumping off point for our listeners, and they may well want to look into it further. But I'm going to invite the rest of the panel back in, and hopefully everyone can turn their cameras back on, and we'll go to some of the questions that have come back in from our listeners. There's a lot there. I suppose probably group some of them in terms of questions around building in scope, buildings that are within scope. So we've got some questions around, you know, are buildings with basements, does the basement count as a story? We've got some questions around permitted development if suddenly an office block changes to being mixed use. So I don't know if anyone from the panel wants to jump in there about you know, any questions that or any ambiguity that there might be still around buildings in scope.
I can answer the height question, please. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'll go with Andrew first and then move to Amanda.
The height measurement is measured from the external ground level. So it's the lowest external ground level to the uppermost floor level. There's some ambiguity about whether it would include a public and amenity space or an amenity space open to wider residents in there, because I think most people under the current building regulations thought it would, but I'm noticing under the Building Safety Fund applications that the upper floor, which is a roof terrace, is not being counted as a floor. It is only the habitable flat accommodation that is. So I would say it's from the lowest external ground level to the uppermost accommodation floor with flats on it.
Okay, so not including basements then?
No.
Okay, and then yes, the point on permitted development, I don't know, Amanda, if you want to come in on that one.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Yeah, no, I think permitted development at the moment is outside this regime, but because I think generally the complexity of these sorts of in-scope buildings the two won't coincide. But I'm a safety lawyer rather than a planning lawyer, so I can't be definitive on that.
I mean, if there are, sorry, come in, Andrew, on that.
So yeah, apologies. I believe in the guidance that accompanies Planning Gateway 1, there is something that says that there will be something for permitted development applications. It is not this formal route that we're talking about today, but there will be something introduced that sits alongside permitted development applications.
Okay. Other listeners are concerned around the issue of residents who may have disabilities, and are the rules only applying to apartments or flats that are designated as disabled access, or do you have to consider that there could be disabled building users anywhere in the building? How does that sort of disability access point play out?
From my side, the building safety gateway itself specifically mentions accessible housing. So it's specifically talking about houses specifically designed for disabled occupants. However, from a fire engineering perspective, we're always looking to make sure that it's inclusive for all flats. So we'll need to consider, for our own perspective, that we're happy to support the design that adequate provisions are made for disabled means of escape from any flat. From a fire engineering.
Okay.
There is also a consultation out at the moment about PEEPs, so personal emergency evacuation plans, and the proposal is that these will be used in general needs accommodation as well as specialised accommodation, which would be a radical change, and also I suspect impractical, as in the fire, the fire and rescue service comes to put the fire out, they don't come to evacuate people. And if you offered that right to have a personal evacuation plan to everybody within a building, even the general needs building, so it's not specialised in any way for older people or disabled people, you would probably find 10 to 15% of the occupants would say they needed some sort of assistance. And it just wouldn't be practical, for the fire and rescue service. So I think that's an interesting one, and that consultation is out now. So if you have views on that, I would strongly recommend you participate in the consultation, because my personal view, this is not Trower's view, it is just, it's not practical, it's not workable. But I shall have to find a more diplomatic way of responding to the consultation in order to sort of address it appropriately. But I think that's very interesting in the context of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are very, very strong views sort of the other way as well. Just slightly related to that, then there are quite a few questions coming in again about building types and whether they come in scope, and questions around buildings like hotels and care homes, and people not quite sure whether those are in scope or not. Can Andrew or Amanda provide any clarity on that?
I can clarify they're not in scope at the moment, but they may well be in time. As Amanda set out, the Secretary of State had the power to include any types of buildings of any height in the legislation anytime he or she wishes to in the future. And I think continually MHCLG and HSE have been considering which buildings should be in scope of the new building safety legislation. And I think another incident in such a building may well force them to include such buildings in scope.
So, I mean, this is your personal opinion, Andrew, but you're kind of of the opinion that they haven't started with all of these buildings, but they probably will eventually become part of it.
I think so. I mean, I think hotels perhaps are seen as something that may be safer than typical residential buildings, because they have maybe more advanced alarm systems, sprinklers, etc. But we've got care homes, hostels, hospitals, which need further consideration. But I come back to my point with Dame Hackitt recognising that the industry would fall over if we included all these buildings in the legislation. So Gateway 1 is relatively easier, as we've just talked about. But if we included Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 in the legislation with all these wider buildings, I mean, just on residential buildings, the drop if we stick with the 18 metres and 7 stories in residential buildings, there are 400 buildings a year that are in scope, new build. So that's 400 buildings that come in every year. There are 15,000 existing buildings out there. If we dropped it down to 11 metres, we're going to add probably another 100,000 existing buildings into the mix. So, I mean, Chris talked about the capacity of fire engineers at the moment. The industry, building owners, legal advisors, architects, fire engineers, we wouldn't be able to cope with the requirements if all buildings were brought into scope from day one.
Yeah, so it's a pragmatic approach. You start with the core buildings that we know are very high risk, and then you build it out gradually while you're building the capacity and the competency within the industry.
I think that's very likely to happen, yes.
Yeah. And just on that point, Chris, you know, you made the powerful point that there are only so many fire engineers, and that's got to increase by at least 50%. How realistic do you think that is, and what have you seen happening to kind of make that a reality?
There's a lot of engineers with a lot of experience that are currently working their way towards chartership, where in the past it's now EWS1 forms, as well as the London Plan fire statement, and now the Plan Gateway fire statement, starting to move that demonstrable competence, and which is chartership with the IFE or a similar sort of accreditation. So there are a lot of engineers with a lot of qualifications that are moving towards that. And within Hydrock alone, we currently have seven or eight engineers that are currently undergoing their chartership application. So those numbers will come up quite quickly. But obviously, there's just going to be a timescale to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there's a group of questions, I think, around how to actually do these fire statements, and some of the audience have been asking, you know, can you not just demonstrate that you comply through approved document B? Is that a route to showing compliance?
It will be a route. It still needs to be completed within the format of the fire statement, but compliance with approved document B. The MHCLG is keen to point out at the moment that relying on compliance with approved document B cannot be guaranteed as complying with the functional requirements of the building regulations. So it still requires a fire safety professional to confirm that that compliance is sufficient to demonstrate the functional requirements of the building regulations met and an adequate level of safety is met. But that's the best starting point, is the compliance with approved document B, but it cannot be relied on in isolation. It still needs a fire professional to confirm that that is sufficient.
Okay, and I think some of you touched on this in your presentations, but there are questions around, do you need particularly qualified people to be involved in producing the fire statements?
Yes, one of the points I discussed in my presentation regarding competency, it is required to be completed by a suitably qualified fire safety person or someone with demonstrable expertise to complete the fire statement on the type of work they're looking at. The easiest way to demonstrate that would be chartership with the Engineering Council by the IFE or a similar type institution. Okay,
and I get a sense of people trying to find ways around this or ways of doing it slightly differently, but there's another question around, do you have to use the standard fire statement form, or will an alternative document be acceptable?
I'm pretty sure it's got to be the standard form, Chloe.
Yeah, I thought you might say that. Yeah, okay. So sort of breaking out beyond some of the detail around the fire statement, I guess it would be really interesting just to get each of you to just say, I think Amanda touched on this part of the change in the regulatory regime is probably not the biggest, but can you give us a sense of what impact you think it will have on the industry? And I'll just go in turn, maybe starting with Amanda.
I think since Grenfell, we have seen radical sort of voluntary changes, if you like, even before the building safety bill was available in draft. A lot of the sort of improved quality of fire risk assessments and so on, and sort of general consideration of fire risk at the planning stage, it's already happening. And therefore, I don't think when the legislation comes into force, it will be a dramatic impact. As Chris has said, there's a sort of form to be filled in, and it's got to be filled in a particular way. But the sort of information that it's drawing on is information that we'll already have, or will be already in the system, and people will have already considered. So I don't think this particular gateway is going to be that radical, because post Grenfell, people have, organisations have kind of moved in that direction anyway.
Okay, and just as a follow-up to that, I should have said, do you have any particular advice, Amanda, like sort of in terms of summing up, any advice for maybe firms who feel that they are slightly on the back foot, they're hearing about this for the first time? Is there any advice that you've got for construction professionals out there with this coming into force on the 1st of August?
I think, to be honest, if you're in the sector where you are building in scope buildings, or you are looking to develop in scope buildings, you will already be a long way up the learning curve, I hope, because this isn't such a radical departure. So I don't think there's a massive amount of scaling up for sort of skilling up rather for the construction professionals who are already in this sector. As Chris has said, the sort of the various experts that are going to be required to help get the process through and sign off, there are not enough of them. So that's the main issue. I think it's timing to get somebody on board to help you with this, if you haven't already got somebody on board to help you. And there is a massive shortage of fire engineers, because they're being pulled in all directions to do, as Chris said, the EWS1 forms and other elements where they're needed as well on fire risk assessments and so on. So there is the shortage. So it's kind of plan ahead really, and get your people lined up, ready to go. But
yeah, okay, thanks, Amanda. And Andrew, just just to sum up the general impact on the industry and what architects, I guess you'd be sort of speaking from an architect perspective, what architects can do to prepare.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we were looking at for MHCLG was the benefits of this, and certainly from a developer and architectural perspective, and one from a developer's perspective, developers who get plan applications and sell sites are certainly waking up to the fact that they've got to consider fire safety at an earlier stage, and that, besides having to employ a fire engineer, they're having to make sure their buildings are compliant. And I said previously, we've taken on working drawings packages where we found the building is deficiently designed, particularly in relation to fire safety. So one of the things we were able to quantify for MHCLG was the amount of reduction in rework time for buildings. So a lot of rework might happen prior to building regulations application to make sure the building did comply with the building regulations. But there's going to be a lot more work done at plan application stage now, which will reduce the amount of rework later down the line. And I'm not able to quantify that in time or money, but that will be, I'm very likely, in an impact statement that's published publicly somewhere. I mean, for architects, I think it's, the message is don't panic. This is everything you've been doing before. You're just bringing that forward to the planning application stage, and if you put in all of this in your design and access statements, in any case, I think the reason for the standard form, by the way, is that the building safety regulator, HSE, wanted standard information on every application to make it easier for them. And you can completely understand that. We don't want 400 different formats of fire safety statement being submitted to them each year. They wanted that, but I can see that standard form could potentially be embedded in your design and access statement, and then submitted separately as well. So the planning authority can have it embedded in there. So that sits with all your drawings, because remember, it's not just a form. We've got to submit these drawings, which are the site plan with a block identification on. We've got to have the fire brigade access to the site, etc., shown on a series of drawings, which are submitted alongside the form.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And Chris, any sort of final thoughts?
Just as Andrew mentioned, really, and apologies for that, Judith, there is obviously a benefit to just bring this forward, because having fire engineering input at an earlier stage will hopefully mean that you get that advice earlier on in the project design, and that will mean that there'll be less changes needed later on in the project. And by having them involved, it doesn't have to just relate to the land use planning items, but can relate to the full design. Hopefully, moving that forward will involve less changes later on down the line. In terms of the key items for consideration as part of the fire statement, as we mentioned, it's the key points are the relating to fire tender access, water supplies, external walls design, as well as sprinkler protection and things like that. That pre-consultation is going to be really important, whoever that will be with HSE or the local fire service, particularly in areas where the local fire and rescue service are very busy, and pre-consultation can be difficult in those areas, such as London boroughs. That will be a challenge, but it'll just be where you're looking to deviate from prescriptive guidance that will need to be included before moving on and completing the fire statement.
Okay, look, thanks very much. We're going to wrap it up there, but we've had so many questions. Thank you very much to the audience for posting all of those. And I think obviously it's early days and not rolled out yet, so maybe it's a theme that we can come back to and have a look at some of the impact and see how the industry is coping. But thank you very much to my guests, so to Amanda, to Andrew and to Chris. A reminder that you can get this on demand, so you can see their slides again if you've missed any of the detail, and do come back at 2 p.m. Where we have another webinar on a similar topic. So thanks very much to everybody for today, and goodbye.